and welcome to 10xMarketer podcast. This is your host, Girdharee Saran, and I have Jim Gianoglio with me. He is founder of Causal Analytics and host at Major Up podcast. He's quite known for his expertise on mixed market modeling, and we discussed MTA and MMM much in detail during our chat. If you really want to learn analytics and learn these attribution models, I definitely recommend listening to this episode end to end. Before we jump into the episode and listen to what Jim has to share, can I request you to quickly subscribe to the 10x Marketer podcast wherever you're listening from? We are available on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube channels. So let's jump into the episode and talk to Jim.
Jim Gianoglio, founder of Causal Analytics. I focus mostly on marketing mix modeling, which is just sort of maybe your audience has heard those terms, and the MMM has been crossing their LinkedIn feed, and that's where I focus my effort on, is helping marketers understand what's working and what's not, what channels are performing well, which channels maybe aren't performing as well. As a supplement to other measurement methodologies they may be using, like multi-touch attribution or even last click attribution, which a lot of people still are using. And so it's just another way of better understanding the holistic picture of your marketing spend and performance. Before that, I actually way back when got into this whole digital marketing and analytics space by doing search engine optimization. That was my foot in the door. And then moved over into the web analytics side, where I spent a lot of the past 10, 15 years. And then recently just founded Causal Analytics, where we're working with clients to do marketing mix modeling, testing of marketing, so geolift experiments and randomized controlled trials, and other sort of advanced analytics use cases.
Okay, so as you pointed out rightly, my audience are mostly marketers, and most of them might not have that in depth understanding of marketing modeling. People like me are more dependent on last click or first click because that's where our limitation is. Can you start by defining, let's say, MMM, and help me understand the real use case of this, and then we'll go in depth into the episode?
Yeah, absolutely. So one way to start off is first by looking at multi-touch attribution, which a lot of marketers are using, which I would argue, last click or first click is just a very simplified form of multi-touch attribution, where you're collecting all of the data about your users at the user level. They clicked on this ad, they came to your website, they purchased, or they viewed this YouTube ad, and then maybe they saw your Google paid search ad and clicked on it and came to your site and purchased. And you're following all those touch points that each individual user has, and then saying, oh, well, here's the purchase that happened, and we're going to decide how to credit those previous touch points. So it's very granular. You have to be able to kind of track at the user level to know all of the different touch points that they had with your media, and then basically assigning credit for the conversions that happen. With marketing mix model, and we refer to that as deterministic tracking, right? We are determining the credit because we have all of the data and we can see everything. Marketing mix modeling or media mix modeling or econometrics, you'll hear it called a bunch of different things that are mostly basically the same thing. And this is a probabilistic method of understanding the performance of your marketing. And when we say probabilistic, we mean we're using statistics, right? We're looking for correlations and patterns in the data to understand, what happens if you spend more in Facebook? Do you get more sales? If you spend less in Google Ads, do your sales go down? And ultimately, like at the very high level, that's what we're doing, right? We're looking for patterns in the data. What lines up with increased revenue? Oh, we boosted our spend in this channel and we saw more sales, right? And so the model itself is a fancy, sophisticated mathematical function that just says, here's the relationship between these two things, our independent variables and our dependent variable, right? So our channel spend and our sales.
Okay, so as I understand it correctly, this entire modeling is based on the historical data, and then you are coming with some probability of which channel to focus on, where to go for your next marketing investment, which channel might not be working so well for you in near future.
Exactly.
Uh, okay, so I hope I make sense when I'm trying to explain it my own words. But how much is the accuracy level when you're talking about historical data? Because given the speed of change that is happening right now, if you let's say take a data of last 1 year, how much accuracy you can expect from the probabilities that you calculate?
Yeah, that's a great question. Most MMMs are starting with at least 2 years of data, right? 1 year of data is a little bit thin, so usually you're looking at least 2 years of data, maybe more. And you rightly called out that historical performance doesn't necessarily dictate what's going to happen tomorrow or next week because things change at a very rapid pace. And I would say that most models are you know uh, depending on a lot of factors can get pretty good at having a pretty certain amount of confidence in the what the model is saying. And one of the benefits of marketing mix modeling is that you should get that understanding of the uncertainty, right? So anytime you run a marketing mix model, you're going to have something that says, we're pretty confident in this model, whether you're looking at something like mean absolute percent error or MAPE, or if you're looking at R squared, which is another metric that you can use to kind of gauge how well the model is understanding the noise in the data. There are various statistical measures that will say, here's how this model is performing, here's how accurate this model is. And so you can kind of use that to say, okay, this model has, an average error of 10% or 20% or 5%. And so I've never seen any like good benchmarks of like, you should have your model with at least 5% error. That's usually, what you see in practice is, you want to get down to obviously as low of an error rate as possible, right? So like 5% would be pretty good. Like if your model can account for all of the factors that are going into whether, how many sales you have, and there's a 5% error, that's a pretty good rate. Anything over 10% error, you're kind of getting into the realm of, well, it's not as great because it's not going to help. If there's a 10% error, you have to kind of think about that in the back of your mind and say, well, take it with a grain of salt, right? But the other thing that you get out of good MMM is not just what's the error rate, but what's the confidence interval or the credible interval of what it's saying. So it might say Facebook has an ROI of 3.7, but the confidence interval around that, meaning how sure are we that it's 3.7? Well, it could be between 2.2 and 5.8. That's kind of the bounds of our confidence in that, right? So you might say that we're 95% sure that it's between 2.2 and 5.8 or whatever I said. So you get that sort of sense of uncertainty around the channel and around the model's understanding of that channel. And there are a lot of things that can influence that, right? If you have a very low amount of spend in a channel, it's not going to provide really enough signal to the model to be able to understand how that's influencing sales. So the amount of spend that you have in that channel is going to factor into how certain the model is. The variability in your spend in that channel. If you just keep your spend level for across the board, there's not enough variation for the model to say, oh, when you increase spend, what happens to sales? If you decrease spend, what happens to sales? So you really need that variability as well. But in terms of long-winded answer to your question, yeah, there's ways to understand how your model is performing, how accurate it is. But to circle back around to the other part of your question around how things are changing quickly, and you're looking at 2 years of historic data, how good is that at sort of forecasting or predicting what's going to happen next week, given the rapid changes in the environment and everything? And that's where you really need to have strong model validations. So you can run what we call holdout, right? You can say, okay, I have this model, and now I have a new week's worth of data or a new month's worth of data. How well does this model predict this new week or this new month of data? And so you can start to do that sort of validation of the model. How well is it able to take into account new data that it hasn't seen yet, and how close is it at sort of forecasting what we already know happened?
Okay, so I think one of the important aspect that may derail the entire process is some big events like a sudden regional war or a conflict or an event like COVID, because that would completely change the perspective and the entire process. Uh, how do you actually take these factors into account, or all the external noise that is happening, that is like affecting the model? How do you take them into account while processing the data or modeling?
Yeah. So marketing mix modeling can be, you could have it fairly simple and include just the factors that are within your control, right? So you could just include your media spend in the channels and maybe some other organic activity like social media activity or emails or things that you're not necessarily putting media budget towards, and just look at how those factors affect sales. Or you could also include things like macroeconomic conditions, weather, COVID, things like that. But those are sort of outside of your control, right? So you can't really do anything about those. It might increase the accuracy of the model, but it's not like you can change those factors. So there's kind of a couple of schools of thought around that. Some people will say just include the variables that are of interest to you, that are within your ability to control, the things that you want to know, like should I spend more, spend less. Sometimes we do want to include some of those other factors like COVID or weather or whatever it might be. One of the differences there is, what are you using the model for? Right? Are you using it to understand the factors that are influencing your sales, to better get a picture of what you might do, next quarter or next year with your media budget? Or are you really using this more for a forecasting tool, right? Do I want to know, how much, what sales should I expect if I make these changes to my media budget across my channels? Right? And to do that forecasting feature, you have to really be able to know what you're putting into the model, right? If I say I want to do a what if scenario planning, right? What happens if I double my spend in Facebook and decrease in Google Ads and whatever else? To be able to do that forecast, you have to put all of the variables that you're including in the model, forecast them forward, which is easy with media spend. You can say, well, what if I spend twice as much? But you can't say, well, what if the GDP of the country decreases, or what if what if COVID happens again? Like, you can't really forecast those things out. And so there's a little bit of just something that needs to be considered if you're starting to build sort of a full marketing mix model, as opposed to sort of a limited media mix model.
Awesome. So the other aspect is, how do you actually understand whether the model is accurate? Are there any key metrics that you should know as a CMO? So I'm talking about somebody who is just a marketing person, maybe not in-depth data analytics or data scientist. Are there any metrics for them to validate the accuracy of information or the data?
Yeah, that's a great question. It kind of comes back to a little bit what I alluded to earlier, as far as sort of the metrics that you can get, the statistical measures of how accurate the model is. And a lot of times you'll hear the R squared thrown out. You'll hear some MAPE, or mean absolute percent error, or sometimes NRMSE, which is normalized root mean squared error, those are basically just a way to say what's the error on this model, right? So the model gives you a line of sort of forecasted revenue based on however much you spent in media. And what it does is it says how far apart is the model's forecasted value of sales compared to our actual sales. So that's the MAPE, the mean absolute percent error, for example. R squared is something that you, from a marketer's perspective, if you have someone coming to you and saying, "Oh, we have this model and it has an R squared of 99%," that's kind of meaningless. It's trivially easy to increase the R squared metric of a model just by adding in additional variables, additional dummy variables. So from a modeler side of things, R squared can give us a sense of how well the model understands the variability in the data, right? How well it's able to understand, and account for the noise in the data, or the variability in the data. But again, it's easy to increase that sort of artificially. So what you really need to be looking for, if you're a marketer and you're either working with a vendor or a SaaS tool or a consultant, you want to understand not just statistical measures of accuracy, but also how well is the model able to predict the future? And that's where validation of the models come in, where you're doing holdout forecasting of the model and say, the model was trained on the past 2 years of data. We're going to see how well that model forecasts for next month and compare it to our actual next month numbers. And that's where you start to see models that have a really great R squared or maybe even a really low error rate don't do well forecasting into the future, maybe because the model is overfit, meaning it's learned too much on the historical data and it's basically just memorized the data, right? And so it doesn't know what to do with new data because it has never seen that before. And so that's what you really want to look for is either a consultant or a vendor or a platform or tool that really has strong validation procedures to say, here's the model, here's how well it does on data it hasn't seen before. And don't get
Awesome.
sucked
So,
into the R squareds and the MAPEs, really.
all right, okay. So the next part of the question is, let's say there are so many privacy regulations are coming, and with AI around the corner, everyone is concerned about how much data these systems are collecting about us as a consumer. Privacy regulations are going to get stronger as we move forward. Uh, how can business actually use MMM with the limited data or aggregation, if at all?
Yeah, and this is why you're seeing such a rise in marketing mix modeling in the past couple of years, right? With Apple and ATT and ITP and all of the privacy changes that they've made, which really starts to erode the data that we're able to collect at that user level, like we talked about with multi-touch attribution, right? Like in the best of days with multi-touch attribution, we were able to collect user level data for most people, and there were no consent modes and opt-outs and all the third-party cookies going away and all of that, right? We had back in the early 2010s up till 2016 17 when GDPR and Apple's technology changes started coming out, you could argue that was the best time that we had the most data, right? And so now we start to see, well, even in those best of times, our data collection capabilities were flawed. We never really had all of the data for all of the people, right? So you can even think about things like non-addressable media. So TV, out of home, billboards, radio, like all of those things that were never even included in multi-touch attribution to begin with. We didn't, we just kind of conveniently shoved those to the side and said, well, we're not worrying about that right now. But then now as really, I think I credit Apple really to kind of like forcing this, which is, we're starting to see like less and less data. We're not able to track a user across all of their touch points with our media and our websites and everything. And that's becoming very apparent. And the more we lose that data or our ability to connect all of the touch points to a user, the less effective multi-touch attribution becomes. Now, vendors and platforms will do fancy things and look for ways to like, server-side tracking. I can still track them with server-side tracking. I can still get that, that capabilities. Or there's certain people that, they opt out, they don't consent to the tracking. So we're going to model that and sort of kind of put in sort of not fake data, but modeled data to kind of account for that loss of data. But at a certain point, the data loss is just so severe that kind of falls apart. And this is where MMM comes in. Sorry, again, long-winded answer to your question, but this is where MMM really shines because we don't need all of that user-level tracking data, right? GDPR in the United States, we have CCPA and various state-level regulations, which are all, in a sense, giving users the ability to not be tracked, along with all the stuff that Apple's doing. That doesn't affect MMM at all, right? All you need for marketing mix modeling is how much you spend in the channels and what is your sales or your conversions, your leads, whatever metric is your conversion metric. You don't need anything at the user level, nothing that would ever be considered private data or user level data. So it's data that's safe, right? You're not going to, you're never, I shouldn't say never, but you're never going to not have access to this data that you need for MMM. Right? It's how much you spent in the channels. What your sales data was. That's your company's data. So it's really sort of a privacy safe way to kind of again, get another idea of how your marketing is performing.
Great. So MMM is the model for the future in that sense.
Yeah, I would say it's the way forward right now. It's, for marketers who are struggling with the limited data that they can collect and starting to see like, I think a lot of marketers already, when you log into Facebook ads and you look at a campaign and Facebook says the ROI is 11. I think most marketers kind of look at that already knowing that that's probably not right. Facebook is overcrediting itself, or they log into Google Ads, or they log into Google Analytics, and they see the numbers, and they kind of know that that's not right, but they don't have a way to basically
Figure out.
give them the right answer. Like, is it too high? Is it too low? What's the magnitude there? And this is where MMM comes in, right? It gives you that second opinion. The analogy I always use is, if you go to a doctor with, pain in your foot, and they say, "Oh, you have, you have the flu." Well, that doctor, you're going to look at them and think that can't be right. I need to go get a second opinion. So you go to another doctor and they say, "Oh, you have a broken foot." It's like, okay, great. I trust the second doctor. He seems a little bit more trustworthy. He seems to know a little bit better, the symptom versus the diagnosis. So that's what MMM is. It's a second opinion, right? It's a more informed opinion. It's across all of your channels, digital versus offline versus other factors that might be at play. And it's just another perspective on understanding the performance of your marketing.
Great. So I like the analogy of the doctors, and that makes part of my the next question. For a business who is starting to implement MMM as a marketing model, what are some of the common pitfalls that they face, and how they can avoid while trying to implement the insights?
That's a great question. Pitfalls when you're just getting into it. Maybe I'll take a step back and talk about when's the appropriate time to start looking at MMM, right?
Yeah, that
From what I've said so
also
far,
makes sense.
yeah, from what I've said so far, you'd think everyone should be doing MMM, and that's not necessarily the case, right? So if you're only spending in Facebook and Google Ads, you don't need MMM, right? You only have 2 channels. You don't need a complex model to tell you what's happening. You can kind of know what's happening based on how much you're spending in those 2 channels. You don't need, there's not a lot of sophistication there, right? You're going to see, if you spend more in Facebook, you're going to see the immediate effect in your sales. If you're spending a low volume of media spend, so if you're spending less than $5 million a year, dollars, or maybe, sometimes it depends. Maybe even if you're spending $1 million a year or $2 million a year and a media spend, that's kind of the point where you want to start looking at marketing mix modeling. If you're spending less than that, again, a model is going to have a hard time seeing the patterns in the data, right? There's just not enough spend to make that sort of correlation. So spend levels and the number of channels that you're using. So again, if you're using 3 channels, Google Ads, Facebook, and TikTok, you're too early. You don't really need to go to model for that. But when you start incorporating a lot of other channels, especially the hard to measure ones like podcasting or linear TV or out of home, that's where it really makes sense to start to incorporate a model. I would say in terms of the pitfalls, one pitfall I'll mention is less of a pitfall and just something that I see time and time again, which is marketers don't have their data together, right? They don't have a marketing data warehouse, whether it's in Google's BigQuery or AWS or some sort of a data warehouse where they have all of their marketing data together, right? And so I've worked with clients where we get started and I'm asking for data about their daily spend in all of their Facebook campaigns and Google Ads and TikTok and everywhere else. And they go to their team and say, okay, go into Google Ads and download the CSV of our spend levels, and go into Facebook Ads and download the CSV, export CSV. And you don't want to be in that spot because it's just going to be prone to error. It's manual and tedious. It takes time for your team to have to pull all of that data. And especially it's not just a once and done thing. You're going to be pulling that every week or every month or every quarter maybe. And so you really want to have that automated. There are a million tools out there like Fivetrans and Supermetrics and whatever it might be that allow you to connect to all of those different ad platforms, pull that data together into a data warehouse, like BigQuery, for example, and then it's all there ready for you to go. So I would say that's like the good first step. If you're thinking about getting into marketing mix modeling, make sure you have your data together first, because you're going to have that anyway. So
Yeah, I think for most marketers, even setting up the tracking correctly is still a challenge. So forget about having the data at a centralized place. That's for big enterprises.
exactly, yeah.
And
And
the
fortunately,
next question.
yeah, there's some really good tools like Supermetrics. They've just introduced a new update to kind of how their tool is working, new features and things like that. And there are some fairly cost-effective ways to go about doing this that you don't even necessarily have to be technical. There's a lot of you log in, you say I want to connect to this ad platform, and I want to send it over to this database, and it'll do it for you. So
Great. So, in terms of the tool and the expenses versus the ROI, at what spend level or how many platforms minimum that you should have when you can start thinking about MMM as a viable marketing model to help you build the marketing strategies?
yeah, absolutely. I would say my rules of thumb, my sort of benchmarks are around, if you have starting around, let's say $1 million US dollars of spend each year,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of the point where you maybe want to start looking at MMM. Some people will say higher than that. Some people say 5 million. I would say when you start approaching that kind of $1 million in spend a year, that's where you want to start looking at it. I would say in terms of the number of channels, if you're only spending in 2 or 3 channels, probably not ready yet. Above that, if you're 3, 4, or 5 channels and more, again, that's the time where you want to start looking into that.
Okay, but these are only the paid channels we are talking about. How about the organic or maybe AI mentions or other new channels like podcasting and other mediums that you are really going high on, and maybe you're spending more on the PR because there's no connectivity with PR and the data that you get. The only source that you may have is mostly Google Analytics, and that also is trying to hide more than show more.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Um,
how do you decide whether the organic or the all the thought leadership effort that are right now kind of corrected as the next big step for brands? Like, you have to invest in thought leadership, you have to invest in being authentic. How do you really measure anything like that with a model like Because a paid marketing, at least they give you a dashboard where you can see all the ROI and everything else. But for any organic channel, there's nothing that gives you all the historical data at one place.
exactly. Yeah. So with organic channels, so like organic social, or even you could throw email into that, or PR. Even if there's not necessarily a direct spend associated to the activity, there's some there's some investment that you have to make, right? Either you have a team that's doing the social posting, or you have with email you have to pay your ESP provider, things like that. There is some spend there, but typically the way you incorporate those into a model would be to use impressions, right? So you would say, here's how many emails we sent on this day, or here's how many how many impressions we got from organic posts on each day. So you can still look at other factors associated with those organic mediums. You could even include organic search, right? For example, you could log into Google Search Console. You could get your organic search impression data. You could break that into branded versus non-branded pretty easily. And so you can incorporate those data points too as well. And so again, the model is just looking at patterns in the data. Oh, we saw non-branded organic search spiked up on this day, and we also saw our sales revenue increase as well. And so it's just looking for those patterns data too. So you can use those. It doesn't just have to be your media spend data.
Okay, now let's talk about ROI at the channel level and how do you connect this with the MMM. So let's say you have as your marketing predictions or the analysis of your historical data is pointing uh, slightly edge to a certain platform. Let's say you see that Google is performing better than Meta for a certain enterprise platform, But when you actually go and implement these strategies, you spend more on Google, and suddenly you see that the spend is increasing, but the actual number is still the same, or my ROI is dropping significantly. Because uh, I've seen this kind of trend wherever we see that yes, this platform is performing well, and we increase the budget, let's say 20%, and then suddenly things have a steep decline. uh, I'm sure models cannot predict this kind of behavior, or if they can, because in the historical data also you'll see the spend going up, ROI coming down. Those kind of pattern would definitely be visible. So can you do these kind of predictions also with MMM?
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely. And
you
so
should not go beyond a threshold in terms of increasing your budget, otherwise your ROI will be coming back to where it was.
exactly, yeah. So the initial model that you build is going to say, okay, yeah, Google Ads has an ROI of 5, and Facebook has an ROI of 4. So you say, okay, I'm gonna invest 20% more in Google Ads, and this part of output of pretty much any marketing mix model is going to be a diminishing return curve, which is critical for understanding what level of spend is optimal for you, right? And so the diminishing return curve tells you just what you said. You spend more and your ROI is going to go down. The more you spend in a channel, the less effective it's going to be, right? You're saturating the channel. You've reached all of the people who are going to buy. Now the audience left for people for you to reach is either they're not as interested or they're not going to buy. So like that effect is going to taper down over time. And so the models will produce these charts for you that show you for each channel that you're measuring, what's that diminishing return curve look like, right? Has it already flattened out, or is it still going up pretty steeply? And so, most models or platforms or open source packages that you do this with will have some form of sort of budget optimization function that says, given your current spend levels and the ROIs of these channels and their diminishing return curves, we think you should increase budget here, you should decrease over here, and try to get to that sort of what's the maximum output you can get from your media spend. And so you can use that as sort of a guiding principle to say, okay, we see this model, it's pretty confident in this channel. We think we should spend more here. So you spend more. Yes, you are going to see your ROI decrease. And more importantly, the marginal ROI, if you want to go kind of next level, right? So you want to be paying attention to the marginal ROI, right? So this is something I still, I guess I just intuitively understand it, but I still see a lot of marketers and analysts making this mistake where they just look at the ROI. We've been trained by the platforms. We've been trained by Google and Facebook. Like, oh, I look in Facebook ads and it says for this campaign, my ROI was 4.7, right? That's the average ROI, right? That's for the entire amount of money that you've spent. On average, here's the ROI across that. But we know, because of those diminishing return curves, we know that the initial, let's say you spent $10,000, the first $5,000 might have had an ROI of 7, and then the next $3,000 maybe had an ROI of 6, and then the last, I've lost the numbers. The last $2,000, the ROI on that last $2,000 was only 4, right? The platforms don't show you that. This is
Yep.
the kind of stuff you can get out of MMM. It's like, well, what's the value of the last dollar into that channel? Because if your target ROI is 5, meaning you can't have an ROI of less than 5, or else that channel's unprofitable for you. You're losing money. Facebook might say, oh, your ROI is 6.5. Great, let's spend more. But what it doesn't tell you is that actually the last dollar in, the ROI was only 4. The earlier dollars in were really ROI positive, but the last dollars in were actually unprofitable for you. And so this is where you get into the really interesting insights and that you can get out of a model. Is like, okay, I'm not just looking at my average ROI. I'm looking at my marginal ROI. Where do I need to spend more money now that's profitable for me?
Yeah, so the other part, and that is an important part of the entire discussion, is how the AI and machine learning going to impact MMM as a model, and how easy it would be for someone like me who is just a marketer, not the technical side, use MMM, or maybe do some modeling on our own by learning with AI. And if at all we try, how dangerous it would be.
Yeah, that's a great question. Everyone's obviously like AI is invading everything, and it's gonna save the world or kill the world, depending on what perspective you take. But from a modeling side, marketing measurement side, I think where I see the value of AI and machine learning is more on the side of making it easier to get to that point where you can start doing the modeling. A lot of the data prep that you need to do. I use R, the programming language R, for a lot of my modeling, and I'm pretty good with R, but I don't know it inside and out. I'm not like the expert in R, so I always have ChatGPT open in a window, and when I need to transform some data in some way, I'm like, oh shoot, I forget how that function works. So I go into ChatGPT. I say, I need to do this thing and this thing. How do I do that? And it says, oh, here's the code for doing that. And I at least know enough of the code to say, oh, I see what it's doing here. That's good. Or I think it got it wrong here. So like you have to have a certain base knowledge, base understanding. But it speeds up the process immensely from the code side of things. I don't see a point in the near future, in the next 5 years. I'll go ahead and be bold and make a prediction. I don't see anywhere in the next 5 years where ChatGPT or whatever large language model you're using is able to say, you just give it all of your data and have it build a model for you, or have it do just tell you where to spend more and where to spend less. I think that's a little bit naive. I think there's a lot of nuances into marketing mix modeling and how it's done well that it's hard to just have an AI do that for you. Everything from like understanding the nuances of how affiliate marketing works, or how influencer marketing works. Think nuances to your specific business. Oh, we know we ran these promotions because every 15th of the month, and at the end of the month is payday, and that's when people spend with us. And so we maybe sometimes offer these discounts or promotions on those days. There's so many things that can go into the model that that are sort of contextual knowledge about our specific business and how we work, that just giving your data to a model and saying, tell me what I should do, I think that's just very dangerous. And again, I don't see a point, even as rapidly as these models are advancing, I don't see that getting to a point where we can just give it our data and have it tell us what to do.
That's so true and bang on. I think that's the analysis that most marketers would go with, rather than just blindly trying to learn everything using ChatGPT. Now, let's come to the concluding question, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. What is your advice to a new business that is going to? We talked about the pitfalls and how to avoid them, but some maybe tips, tricks, strategies, or overall your advice to someone who is looking at MMM as the solution for their marketing projections or implementing the marketing strategy as a granular level.
Yeah, I think for new businesses, thinking about getting into MMM that haven't done it before, the real challenge is that they don't have that expertise in house to know what kind of questions to ask or how to go about it, right? Because there's a lot of different ways that you could get started with MMM. There are a lot of open source packages. If you have a data scientist in house, they could go and use Meta's open source package called Robin. They could use one called PyMC Marketing, which is an open source package for Bayesian marketing mix modeling. Or Google has announced, they had one called Lightweight MMM. It was never officially supported, but now they've sort of created an official open source marketing mix modeling package called Meridian. It's still closed access. They haven't made it generally available yet, but they're looking to do that in the early next year. So there's a lot of options if you want to bring it in-house. And then there's also the options of, do you go with a vendor or a platform that can do this for you? And I would say if you're just starting out, if you don't have those internal resources, if you don't have a data scientist who understands marketing, right? Because not all data scientists understand, and I would say most data scientists don't understand the nuances of marketing and how it works. But if you don't have a data scientist or a team of data scientists and marketers working together internally, it's probably not a good idea to try to in-house this. Even though there's, like I said, there's a lot of ways to do that. A lot of open source packages. You don't have to reinvent the wheel yourself. That's going to be a tough challenge for you. I would say probably the smarter thing would be to look at vendors and platforms in the space that can help you get your feet wet with MMM. And again, it's a challenge because you don't know what you don't know with MMM. And so if you talk to 10 vendors, you're going to get we have all the bells and whistles and we can give you a model that's 100% accurate. And like, for someone who doesn't know about MMM, it's hard to know, what's true and what's not. So, there are a couple of resources that you can use to help vet some of these ideas or these other vendors. I would say, learn a little bit about the process and what it looks like. Learn the types of questions to ask of your vendors. So there's some really great resources on Recast's website. Recast is full transparency. I'm a partner with Recast. Their website is getrecast.com. They have a lot of good educational content around specifically these specific questions around what kind of questions should you ask your vendor? What are the things that you should look for in a vendor or in a platform? So spend an hour, look through some of this educational content, and I would say go with a vendor that is able to help you kind of get started with it. And then if down the road you realize the value of it and you want to take it in-house and you want to build a more complex, nuanced model that fits your business, then you can kind of go that route. But again, it's not a trivial thing to do, right? Even though all of the open source packages are fairly easy to get started with if you know what you're doing, it still requires a lot of resources internally. So that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, and I think the other part, maybe I'll try to add my point if that makes sense. The other important part for a business is one is how much is the accuracy level of data that you're collecting, both in terms of your ROI, ROS, and tracking capabilities. And second is how you're storing it. Is there any centralized mechanism? I think that should be the step one before going to an MMM and trying to understand what it can bring for me. Even if you have a clear, accurate data which is not corrupted by any external medium, that also make a significant impact on how accurate the vendor or tool is going to give you in terms of the results or projections. So I think that is also an aspect that most businesses should start looking at when they reach at a spend level of, let's say, 0.5 million or say 0.8 million, and that's when they start thinking of MMA as one of the viable factors. So before going to MMA, maybe spend 6 months collecting data, having a process for uh, putting it in a centralized software so that you can start thinking about the next level of implementation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even like there's no wrong time to start centralizing your data, right? Even if you're not
Yeah.
spending $1 million, like if you're
Yes.
spending $100,000, that's still a lot of money, right? Like
Yep.
if you're spending on 3 different platforms and you're spending $100,000, don't you want a dashboard that has all that data together that you can even just look at and see side by side Facebook, Google, TikTok? Like there's a lot more reasons and a lot more benefit that you can get out of having your data kind of centralized together all together. From a reporting perspective and from an analysis perspective, that then you have that foundation there. And when you get to the point where you want to start exploring MMM, your data is already there, right? So yeah, it's never a wrong time to invest in some good clean data warehouses.
Thank you, Zim. I think we had a fantastic chat, and I really loved talking to you. I'm not sure how much you enjoyed because my questions were basic and high level.
No, this is great. This is great.
So thank you so much for joining, and it was really lovely talking to you. And thank you so much, guys, for listening to us so far. Make sure you subscribe to 10x Marketer podcast as I keep bringing some great marketing minds like Jim, and we keep talking about some interesting marketing topics. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.